My daughter-in-law slammed an $8,000 bill onto the table and shouted, "That's it! Either you pay this, or you're both going to a nursing home." Then my husband, who had been silent the entire time, slowly stood up, straightened his suit, and fixed his gaze on our son, his eyes heavy with sorrow. No one in that room could have imagined what would happen next. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story, and write in the comments which city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. My name is Ada, and at 61 years old, I never thought I'd be sitting at my own kitchen table while my daughter-in-law slapped an $8,000 bill in front of me like I was some delinquent borrower who'd refused to pay a debt. The crack of the paper hitting the wooden table seemed to echo through our small dining room, and my heart skipped a beat. Emery stood there, her perfectly manicured hands still pressed on the document, her face twisted with a fury I had never seen before, not even during her worst outbursts over the last 2 years. "It's over!" she screamed, her voice slicing through the quiet afternoon. "Either you pay this, or you're both going to a nursing home." I stared at the bill, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of the numbers. It was from some medical billing company I didn't recognize, dated just last week, with charges that meant nothing to me. Emergency room visits, specialist consultations, procedures I didn't even remember having. My throat tightened as I lifted my gaze to Emery, her green eyes burning with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "I don't understand," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "What is this for?" Emery let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Don't act stupid, Ada. These are your medical bills, the ones you've been hiding from us, the ones that are draining us dry because you're too selfish to take responsibility for your own health." I felt the color leave my face. Yes, I had been to the doctor recently, but nothing that should have added up to $8,000. A routine checkup, some blood tests, nothing more. I opened my mouth to explain, but before I could say a word, Harold cleared his throat. My husband had been sitting quietly at the head of the table, his worn hands folded, his gray eyes focused somewhere beyond the window. He hadn't said much since Emery had arrived an hour earlier, just listened while she ranted about expenses, responsibilities, and how we were becoming too much of a burden for her and Randall. Now Harold slowly rose. At 73, every movement was careful, but there was a quiet dignity to the way he stood that seemed to fill the room. He adjusted his navy blue cardigan, the one I had knitted for him 3 Christmases ago, then turned his attention to our son. Randall stood by the kitchen counter, arms crossed, his expression a mixture of discomfort and guilt. He refused to meet his father's gaze, staring at the floor like he used to when he was 12 and had shattered Mrs. Henderson's window with his baseball. Harold's eyes were unwavering, but in his expression, I saw something that made my chest tighten. Not just anger, though disappointment was there, but something deeper, closer to grief. "Son," Harold said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 70 years of life and hard-earned wisdom. "Look at me." Randall's head snapped up, and for a brief moment, our 35-year-old son looked just like the frightened boy who used to run into our bedroom during thunderstorms, looking for safety. But today there was no storm outside, only the toxic tension that Emery had dragged into our home. "Is this really what you want?" Harold asked, his tone so soft I had to strain to hear him. "Is this really the man you've decided to become?" The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear the old refrigerator humming in the corner, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, and faint sounds of children playing outside in the same neighborhood where Randall had grown up, where we had poured our love and sacrifices into raising him, hoping he'd become a man we could be proud of. Emery's cheeks flared red. "Don't you dare try to guilt-trip him," she snapped at Harold. "We've been supporting you two for months. Groceries, utilities, house repairs. We can't keep bleeding money just because you're too proud to admit you need professional care." Tears burned at the corners of my eyes. It was true that Randall had been helping us financially since Harold's retirement benefits were cut last year. The company he had given 37 years of his life to had gone bankrupt, taking most of his pension with it. We had struggled to cover our expenses, and our son had stepped in without us even asking, just like we had raised him to do. But a nursing home, professional care, the very idea made me feel sick. I had spent enough time visiting those places when my own mother was dying to know what they were really like. The harsh smell of disinfectant that never fully covered the scent of decay. The vacant stares of residents lined up in wheelchairs, facing televisions they weren't really watching, the exhausted staff, treating people like tasks to be completed instead of human beings deserving respect. "We're not ready for that," I said, finally finding my voice. "We're still independent. We just need a little help sometimes." Emery spun toward me, her blonde hair whipping over her shoulders. "Independent? You call this independent? Your husband can barely climb the stairs without losing his breath, and you've been having memory problems for months." "I have not," I protested. But even as I spoke, doubt crept in. There had been times when I walked into a room and forgot why I'd gone there. Moments when I struggled to recall the name of a neighbor I'd known for 15 years. I had blamed it on stress and age, nothing more. Harold moved again, stepping around the table with slow, purposeful strides until he was standing directly in front of Randall. They were almost the same height now, my son having inherited his father's tall, lean frame. But somehow, Harold still seemed to tower over him, the way he always had, with that quiet authority that didn't need raising a voice to be heard. "Randall," Harold said, and this time his voice sounded different, heavier, carrying a weight I had never heard before. "Before you make any decisions about your mother and me, there are some things you need to know. Things I've kept to myself because I wanted to see what kind of man you really are." Randall's face went pale. "Dad, what are you talking about?" Harold reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather notebook. I'd seen him writing in it over the last few months, usually late at night when he thought I was asleep. When I asked, he always brushed it off, saying he was just keeping track of things, nothing important. "This," Harold said, holding the notebook up, "contains every conversation, every demand, every threat your wife has made over the last 6 months. Dates, times, details, things I think you'll find very interesting." For the first time, Emery's confident mask slipped. It was quick, so quick I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching her. But I saw the flash of panic in her eyes before she forced her expression back into something controlled. "That's ridiculous," she snapped, though her voice didn't have the same force anymore. "You're just trying to stir up trouble where there isn't any." Harold calmly opened the notebook and flipped through a few pages, his finger tracing his neat handwriting. "March 15th, he read. "Emery tells Ada that if she stops taking her heart medication, the family will save money on medical bills. March 22nd, Emery suggests that Ada's confusion might be an act for attention." My blood ran cold. I remembered those conversations. I had brushed them off, convinced myself I was being too sensitive, that I was misinterpreting her words. Harold had been in the room for the first one, but I assumed he hadn't heard. I'd never mentioned the second to anyone. "Dad," Randall said, his voice tight, "what are you saying?" Harold closed the notebook and looked at our son with an expression that held decades of love layered over deep disappointment. "I'm saying your mother and I have been living in fear for months," he replied quietly. "Fear of your wife, fear of losing our home, fear of what tomorrow might bring. And I'm saying that this bill," he gestured toward the paper still lying on the table, "is just the latest in a long chain of lies." The room exploded. Emery started yelling, demanding to know how Harold dared call her a liar, insisting everything she'd done was for the sake of the family. Randall was trying to calm her, while at the same time firing questions at his father, his voice rising with confusion and anger. But I was looking only at Harold, really seeing him for the first time in months. The man I thought had retreated into quiet resignation had instead been watching, listening, documenting. The same man who had built our life with steady hands and unshakable patience had been protecting us in the only way he knew how. And in his eyes, I saw something that sent a rush of fear and hope surging through me. Harold had a plan, and whatever it was, I knew that after today, nothing in our lives would ever be the same. I hadn't always been afraid of my daughter-in-law. In fact, when Randall first brought Emery home 5 years earlier, I'd been overjoyed. She was beautiful, well-spoken, and seemed genuinely interested in our family. She asked thoughtful questions about Randall's childhood, praised my cooking, and even helped with the dishes without being asked. "She's perfect," I whispered to Harold that night as we lay in bed after her first visit. "She really loves him." Harold made a non-committal sound, the kind he used when he was thinking, but not ready to share. I should have paid closer attention to that sound. The changes started small, so gradual I barely noticed them at first. Emery began suggesting little improvements for our home, harmless comments that somehow left me feeling lacking. "This wallpaper is so vintage," she'd say with a bright smile. "With just a little updating, this place could look amazing." She started showing up for visits with cleaning supplies, insisting she just wanted to help, that it was no trouble. But her help always came with running commentary. "Oh wow, when was the last time anyone cleaned behind this refrigerator? Harold, you really ought to be more careful about tracking mud into the house." Harold would watch these moments, his jaw tightening, but he never confronted her. When I tried to talk to him about it later, he would just nod and say Emery was trying to be helpful, that we should give her time to adjust to the family. The isolation began about 2 years into their marriage. Suddenly, Emery had opinions about everything we did. Our weekly dinners with the Kowalskis next door were, according to her, too much socializing for people your age. Our involvement in the church bake sale was too stressful and might affect our health. Slowly, thread by thread, our social life began to unravel. Emery always had a reason why each outing, each visit, each small joy was somehow bad for us. "She's just worried about us," I kept telling myself, even as I found myself canceling coffee dates with old friends and rushing out of church as soon as the service ended, instead of staying to chat. But it was the health concerns that truly started to unsettle me. Emery seemed to know far too much about our medical conditions for someone with no medical training. She pointed out symptoms I hadn't even noticed, hinted that my occasional forgetfulness might be early dementia, fretted over Harold's shortness of breath after climbing the stairs. "You really should see a specialist," she'd say, her voice dripping with concern. "I've been reading about cognitive decline in women your age. The early signs can be so subtle. You might not even notice it at first. Those conversations always left me rattled, anxious, unsure. Was I actually becoming forgetful? Was Harold's breathing really getting worse? I started questioning myself constantly, wondering if I could trust my own memory, if I truly was becoming the burden Emery seemed to believe I was. The money pressure began about 8 months ago. Emery started bringing up finances every time she visited, always wrapped in a blanket of concern. She'd sit at our kitchen table with her laptop open, showing us articles about rising healthcare costs for seniors, the staggering price of long-term care, the importance of planning ahead. "I just want to make sure you're prepared," she'd say sweetly. "Randall and I love you both so much and we want to help, but we have to be realistic about what we can afford." Then she started tracking everything, every grocery receipt, every utility bill, every medical charge. She built spreadsheets showing how much our monthly expenses had climbed over the past year, charts proving how our fixed income couldn't keep up with inflation. "Look at this," she'd say, pointing at her perfectly organized graphs. "Your prescriptions alone are up 30% since last year. And these house repairs? Harold, you really can't keep putting them off. The furnace is going to die completely if you don't replace it soon." The numbers were overwhelming. It was hard to argue when everything was laid out so neatly and professionally. Emery presented it all with such confidence, such apparent expertise, that I felt foolish for even thinking to question her. So, when she suggested we consider alternative living arrangements, it sounded less like manipulation and more like the sad, logical outcome of an impossible situation. Harold tried to push back in his quiet way. "We'll manage," he'd say. "We always have." But Emery always had a prepared response. "Harold, you're not being realistic. What if one of you falls and breaks a hip? What if Ada's memory issues get worse? You can't just hope things turn out fine." She began bringing glossy brochures from assisted living facilities, expensive pamphlets filled with photos of smiling seniors strolling through perfect gardens. "These aren't the nursing homes you're imagining," she'd insist. "These are communities. Look how happy everyone is." Those brochures stayed on our coffee table for weeks, staring back at us. They became a constant reminder of how we were supposedly failing to plan, failing to manage, failing at aging correctly. I'd catch myself looking at the smiling faces, wondering if they were truly content or just posing for the camera. It was Harold who first picked up on the cracks. Little things at first. Medical appointments Emery insisted I had missed that I was certain were never scheduled. Bills for services I didn't remember receiving. Health-related conversations Emery claimed to have had with me, and then repeated to Randall that I had no memory of at all. "Are you sure you told her about those dizzy spells last Tuesday?" Harold would ask quietly after Emery left. I'd search my mind, replaying every detail of our talk and come up empty. I hadn't had dizzy spells, not then, not recently. But Emery's concern had been so specific, so detailed, that I started doubting myself. Maybe I mentioned it and forgot, I'd say uncertainly. Harold would give me that look again, the one that said he was turning something over in his mind but wasn't ready to say it out loud. 3 months ago, he started carrying that little notebook. He'd write in it after Emery's visits, late at night when the house was still. When I asked about it, he shrugged it off, said he was just keeping track of things, nothing important. But I noticed he'd changed. When Emery spoke, Harold listened differently, with a focused intensity I hadn't seen in years. He began asking small, precise questions. What was the name of that specialist again, he'd ask, the one Ada supposedly saw last month? Why does that matter? Emery would snap. The diagnosis is what's important. Of course, Harold would reply mildly. I just like to keep track of these things. I could tell his questions rattled her. She tried to hide it, but I saw the tension in her jaw, the way her smile tightened. I couldn't understand it. If everything she was saying was true, why didn't she want us to have the details? Why did she seem so unwilling to give clear answers? Last month, Harold asked me to start saving all my medical paperwork. Just put it in this box, he said, handing me an old shoebox from the closet. Don't mention it to anyone. The request felt odd, but I trusted him. So I did it. Bills, visit summaries, test results. Everything went into that box. It wasn't until I started sorting through them that the pattern emerged. So many of the charges Emery had claimed mine didn't match anything I remembered. Appointments I had never gone to, services I'd never received, procedures that simply hadn't happened. When I brought it up to Harold, he listened carefully, then asked me not to confront Randall or Emery yet. I need to figure out exactly what's going on first, he said, before we accuse anyone of anything. But sitting here now, watching my husband stand in front of our son with that notebook in his hand, I realized Harold had figured out far more than he'd let on. While I was busy doubting myself, questioning my memory and my sanity, Harold had been quietly recording the truth. The $8,000 bill Emery had slammed down today wasn't the first outrageous charge she'd shown us. It was simply the biggest, the boldest, the final piece Harold needed to confirm what he already suspected. My hands shook as I picked up the bill, looking at it as if for the first time. I read through the charges with fresh eyes. Emergency room visit for chest pain, on a day when I had spent the entire afternoon out in the garden. Specialist consultation for memory problems, on a day I'd been visiting my sister in the next town. Procedure after procedure listed on that bill, things I had never undergone, on dates when I was somewhere else entirely. As the truth began to sink in, a wave of emotions crashed over me. Relief, because I finally knew I wasn't losing my mind. My memory wasn't failing. I wasn't turning into the burden Emery kept implying I was. And rage, hot, sharp rage, because this woman, the person we had opened our home and hearts to, had been systematically dismantling my reality for her own benefit. I looked up and found Harold watching me, and in his eyes I saw that he understood exactly what was happening inside me. He knew I was finally seeing what he'd been seeing for months. My husband, my partner of 42 years, had been protecting me the only way he could, quietly gathering evidence and waiting for the right moment to expose the truth. That moment had arrived. Harold opened the notebook again, this time turning to an early page. His fingers, worn from decades of honest work, traced the neat lines of his handwriting as if he were reading sacred text. The room was so quiet I could hear Emery's fast, shallow breaths and the low hum of the refrigerator. January 7th, Harold read, his voice steady. Emery tells Randall that Ada had an episode of confusion at the grocery store, claiming she forgot where she parked and wandered the parking lot for 30 minutes before asking for help. My stomach twisted. I remembered that day perfectly. I had gone to the store with Emery, and yes, for a moment I'd lost track of where we parked, but I found the car in under 2 minutes. Emery had laughed it off then, saying it happened to everyone. That's not what happened, I whispered. Harold nodded and continued. January 15th. Emery tells me privately that Ada has been forgetting to take her medications and suggests we may need a pill organizer or even professional supervision. I have never missed my medications, I said, louder now. I take them every morning with breakfast. I have for years. Randall stared at his father, confusion etched on his face. Dad, What are you saying? That Emery lied about Mom's condition? Harold turned several pages ahead. February 3rd. Emery shows Randall a bill for $237 from Dr. Morrison's office, claiming it was for a memory evaluation that revealed early signs of dementia. My breath caught. I never saw Dr. Morrison for a memory test, I said. I saw him for my annual physical. He said my cognitive function was completely normal for my age. Emery's face had gone pale, but she tried to recover. You're confused, Ada. You're proving my point right now. You can't even remember your own medical appointments. But Harold was ready. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, thick with paperwork. These, he said, laying the envelope on the table, are copies of all of Ada's actual medical records from the past year, which I requested directly from each doctor's office. He spread the documents out like cards in a game he knew he was about to win. Dr. Morrison's notes from February 3rd describe a routine physical exam with normal cognitive screening, no mention of dementia, no referral for further testing, and absolutely no recommendation for assisted living. Randall leaned forward, scanning the records. I could see the shift in his expression, confusion slowly giving way to horrified understanding. But the bill, Emery stammered, her voice edging toward panic. The bill clearly showed charges for cognitive testing. Harold produced another paper. This is a statement from Dr. Morrison's billing department, confirming that no such charges were ever billed to Ada's account. The bill you showed us was fabricated. That word seemed to suck the air out of the room. Fabricated. My daughter-in-law had forged medical bills, invented symptoms, lied to my son about my health. The magnitude of her betrayal was almost too much to grasp. This is insane, Emery protested, though her voice sounded thin now. Why would I do that? What could I possibly gain? Harold flipped to another page in his notebook. March 20th, he read. You tell Randall our monthly expenses have climbed so high that we need $1,700 a month just to stay in our home. You suggest that assisted living would actually be more economical. Our expenses have increased, Emery shot back. That's not a lie. No, Harold agreed calmly. But the reasons you gave were. He pulled out a stack of receipts and bills and fanned them across the table. These are our real monthly expenses, which I've been tracking carefully. Our actual basic costs are $850 a month, not $1,700. Randall studied the papers like a man trying to decipher a code that might decide his entire future. But what about all these medical bills? He asked hoarsely. The prescriptions, the home repairs? Harold laid out even more documents. The prescription totals you were shown included medications Ada doesn't take and procedures that never happened. The home repair estimates came from companies quoting work we never requested. I watched my son as he took it in. It was like watching someone wake up from a long, tangled dream where nothing quite made sense, and suddenly the pieces started falling into place. The $3,000 furnace repair, Harold continued, was for a unit in a house twice the size of ours. The $5,000 roof quote was for a full replacement, not the small patchwork we actually need. Emery was slowly backing away from the table, her mask cracking with every sentence Harold spoke. You're twisting everything, she insisted. You're making it sound like I was trying to deceive you, but I was just trying to help you plan for the future. By lying about my wife's medical condition? Harold's voice stayed calm, but there was iron underneath it now. By forging fake bills. By cutting us off from our friends and our community. By convincing our son that his parents were slipping into incompetence and needed to be managed like children. Randall shot to his feet, dragging his hands through his hair. He looked like a man who had just discovered his entire reality was built on quicksand. I don't understand, he said hoarsely. Why would you do this? What did you want? For the first time since this all began, Emery didn't have an immediate answer. She just stood there, her mouth slightly open, her eyes darting between Harold's paperwork and Randall's face, as if she were frantically calculating whether there was anything left to save. Harold answered for her. Control, he said simply. She wanted control over our assets, our choices, our lives, and she was using you, Randall, to get it. He flipped to another part of the notebook. April 10th, he read. Emery suggests we give you power of attorney so you can handle our finances more efficiently. April 18th, she brings up the idea of us signing over the deed to the house so it would be protected if we needed Medicaid coverage for nursing home care. My stomach turned. I remembered those talks, presented as thoughtful, caring suggestions from a daughter-in-law who wanted to secure our future. I'd actually been grateful for her help, impressed by how much she seemed to know about elder care and financial planning. May 2nd, Harold continued. Emery tells you that we've agreed to these arrangements and asks when we can meet with a lawyer to finalize the paperwork. We never agreed to anything, I said, my voice finally steady. We never even discussed it seriously. Randall was staring at his wife with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It wasn't just anger, though anger was there. It was something deeper. Raw betrayal, disbelief. The crushing realization that the person you trusted most had been lying to you over and over. Emery, he said quietly, tell me this isn't true. Tell me there's some explanation I'm missing. She opened her mouth, shut it, then tried again. For a second, I thought she might actually break, confess, apologize, beg for another chance. Instead, she did what she'd always done. She attacked. You're going to believe him over me? She shouted, her voice rising to a shrill edge. Your own wife? He's clearly twisting everything, making it all sound worse because he can't handle that his precious son might love someone more than he loves his parents. But Harold was ready even for that. He reached into the envelope one last time and pulled out a small digital recorder. 3 days ago, he said, placing it on the table. You came here while Randall was at work. You thought Ada was napping, but she was in the bathroom, and I was in the kitchen where you couldn't see me. He pressed play. Emery's voice filled the room, unmistakable and clear. Listen, Harold, I know you think you're protecting Ada, but you're not helping her, the recording began. She's getting worse, and you're in denial. The best thing for everyone is if you both move into assisted living voluntarily. If you fight this, it's just going to make things harder on everyone, especially Randall. Harold's recorded voice sounded exhausted. Ada is fine, Emery. Her doctor says she's perfectly healthy for her age. Her doctor doesn't see her every day, Emery's voice snapped back. I do. I see the confusion, the memory lapses, the way she can't keep track of simple things anymore. And frankly, you're not much better. How long do you think you can pretend everything is normal? There was a pause, then Harold again. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you stop being stubborn and start thinking about what's best for your family, Emery's recorded voice said. Randall is killing himself, trying to support you while you play make-believe that you're still independent. The house needs repairs you can't afford. Your medical bills are piling up. Your income isn't enough. You're becoming a burden, Harold, and the longer you deny it, the worse it will be. Harold stopped the recording. The silence that followed felt heavy, suffocating. Randall stared at the device as if it were something poisonous. You told me they asked for help, he whispered. You said they came to us because they realized they couldn't manage on their own. Emery's composure finally shattered. I was protecting you, she screamed. They were never going to admit they needed help. They would have kept struggling and pretending everything was fine until one of them ended up in the hospital or dead. I was trying to fix the problem before it became a disaster. By lying to me? Randall's voice was rising now. By manipulating me into thinking my parents were incompetent when they're perfectly fine? They're not fine, Emery shot back. Look at them. They're old, they're broke, and they're going to need care eventually. I was just planning ahead. Harold stood, slow and deliberate, every movement controlled. Emery, he said, and his voice carried an undeniable moral weight. You have been emotionally abusing my wife for months. You have been lying to my son about our health and our finances. You have been manipulating our family relationships for your own benefit. He let the words hang in the air before he finished. But most importantly, you've been trying to steal our home and our independence, using lies and fabricated evidence to justify it. Emery's face twisted with rage. Steal? She spat. I wasn't trying to steal anything. I was trying to help. Help yourself, I shot back, surprising everyone, including myself, with how steady my voice sounded. Help yourself to our house, our money, our son's loyalty. Help yourself to total control over our lives. I stood up. My legs were trembling, but my resolve wasn't. You made me doubt my own mind, Emery, I continued. You made me believe I was losing my memory, turning into a burden, falling apart. You cut me off from my friends and convinced my own son that I was incompetent. Tears were streaming down my cheeks, but they weren't from sadness anymore. They were from anger, relief, and that fierce, painful joy that comes when the fog finally lifts and you can see the truth clearly after months of confusion. But worst of all, I said, my voice getting stronger with every word, you tried to destroy my relationship with my son. You tried to make him see us as problems to be managed instead of people to be loved. The room went silent except for my own uneven breathing. Randall was staring at his wife like he was seeing a stranger. And maybe he was. Maybe all of us were seeing the real Emery for the first time. Harold reached across the table and took my hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. The question now, he said, locking eyes with Randall, is what are you going to do about it? The silence that followed felt endless, though it could only have been a few minutes. Randall stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, his expression shifting through waves of shock, betrayal, anger, confusion, and something that looked very much like grief. Emery was the first to speak, but her voice was different now. The warm, concerned daughter-in-law was gone. So was the efficient financial planner. What came through instead was colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. "You think you're so clever, don't you, Harold?" she said, her tone flat and poisonous. "You think your little notebook and your recordings prove anything. All you've shown is how paranoid and manipulative you are." She turned to Randall, her expression melting into something that might have passed for vulnerability if we hadn't just heard the truth. "Baby, can't you see what's going on here?" she pleaded. "They're trying to turn you against me because they can't handle that you chose me over them." Harold's grip on my hand tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "Randall, look at the evidence," he said. "The medical records, the bills, the recording. Don't let her manipulate you again." "Manipulate," Emery repeated with a brittle laugh. "I'm not the one secretly recording people and hoarding documents to build some conspiracy theory about my own family. This is exactly the kind of paranoid behavior that proves my point about their mental state." I watched Randall's face as she spoke, and I saw her words hitting their target. Even with everything laid out in front of him, even after hearing her own voice on the recorder, part of him still wanted to believe her. He wanted there to be some explanation that didn't involve admitting that the woman he loved had methodically torn his family apart. "The bills are real, Emery," Randall said, though his voice wavered. "Dad has the medical records, which could be falsified," she cut in quickly. "Have you even considered that? That someone whose mind is slipping might not be the most reliable person to organize paperwork. Maybe Harold mixed things up. Maybe he doesn't remember which bills go with which services." She was doing it again, right in front of us, twisting reality, making us question what we knew. But this time, I wasn't going to let her drag us back into that fog. "Show him the bank statements," I said to Harold. Harold nodded. "I thought you might try this angle," he told Emery. He reached into the envelope again and pulled out another stack of papers. "So I also got copies of all our bank statements for the last year." He spread them across the table. "These show exactly what was actually charged, when, and by whom. There are no $8,000 medical bills, no $3,000 furnace repair, no $5,000 roof replacement." Randall leaned in, studying the pages like his life depended on it. I watched him trace transactions with his finger, comparing them in his mind to the bills Emery had shown him. "But I've seen the bills," he said slowly. "You've shown them to me, Emery. I've seen the invoices, the payment notices." "And where are those bills now?" Harold asked quietly. Randall looked around, as if they might suddenly appear on the countertop. "Emery handles all of that," he admitted finally. "She keeps track of their finances, so I don't have to worry about the details." "How convenient," Harold murmured. "And have you ever seen Ada's actual medical records? Have you ever spoken directly to any of her doctors about this supposed cognitive decline?" The color drained from Randall's face as the answer hit him. "Emery said it would be easier if she handled all the medical communication," he said numbly. "She said it would be too stressful for them to have to explain everything over and over." Harold nodded grimly. "Of course she did. Just like she said our weekly dinners with the neighbors were too stressful. Just like she said church events were too much for our health. Just like she insisted we needed protection from ourselves." Emery was edging toward the door now, but the more she retreated physically, the more frantic and combative she became. "This is insane," she snapped. You're making it sound like I planned some huge scheme, when all I did was try to help my husband's aging parents prepare for their future. By lying about their health, Randall asked, and for the first time, there was real anger in his voice. By facing reality, Emery shot back, which is more than any of you seem willing to do. Harold flipped to a page near the end of his notebook. June 15th, he read. Emery tells Randall that Ada had what appeared to be a mini-stroke while grocery shopping, became disoriented, and needed help getting home. I remember that day, I said, my voice steadier now with every new revelation. I went shopping alone because Emery canceled our usual trip at the last minute. I had no problems at all. I came home, put the groceries away, and started dinner. But you told me Mom was confused and terrified, Randall said to Emery, his voice hollow. You said she called you from the parking lot crying because she couldn't remember how to get home. I never called her, I said firmly. I don't even know her number by heart. If I'd needed help, I would have called you. Emery's composure was starting to visibly break. You're all ganging up on me, she snapped. This is a setup. You've been planning this ambush for weeks. June 22nd, Harold continued, ignoring the outburst. Emery brings a brochure from Sunset Manor Assisted Living and suggests we schedule a tour, claiming Ada had shown interest in learning more about their programs. I never said I was interested, I replied. In fact, when you showed me that brochure, I told you I wasn't ready for assisted living. But you told me she was excited about it, Randall said to Emery. You said she was relieved to finally have a plan for her future care. The lies were unraveling fast now. Each one exposed made the next easier to see. Randall looked like a man trying to hold together two completely different versions of reality, and losing. July 1st, Harold read. Emery tells you that Ada and I have agreed to start the process of transferring the house deed and setting up power of attorney, and that we just need to schedule a lawyer to finalize everything. We never agreed to any of that, I said firmly. We never even considered it seriously. Randall turned to Emery, and I saw the exact moment when faith began to crack, when love slammed into hard facts. Emery, he whispered, did you lie to me about all of this? She didn't answer at first. She stood by the door, her expression shifting as she calculated, weighing whether there was still a way out. Finally, when she spoke, her voice sounded strangely lighter, as if telling the truth was a twisted kind of relief. You want the truth, Randall? She said. Fine. Here's the truth. She stepped back toward the table, straightening her shoulders like she'd decided how this was going to end. Your parents are living in a house they can't afford, on an income that barely covers basic expenses, she said. They're pretending everything is fine when it clearly isn't. They're one medical emergency away from bankruptcy, one fall away from total dependence, one crisis away from becoming our full-time responsibility. Her voice grew stronger as she went on, as if she'd been rehearsing this monologue in her head for months. So yes, I exaggerated their symptoms. Yes, I inflated their expenses. Yes, I created a sense of urgency that wasn't there yet. But I did it because someone had to force you all to face reality before it was too late. Harold was writing again, calmly noting down her words, documenting her confession as carefully as everything else. You manipulated me, Randall said, his voice thick. You made me believe my parents were falling apart when they weren't. You made me treat them like children when they were perfectly capable of making their own decisions. I made you take responsibility, Emery shot back. Something you never would have done if I'd just told you the truth about their finances. You would have kept enabling their fantasy of independence until they ended up sick, broke, and entirely dependent on us. That wasn't your decision to make, I said, pushing myself up from the chair. Our lives, our choices, our future, those are ours, not yours. Emery looked at me with open contempt. Really, Ada? And how's that working out for you? She sneered. You're living month to month on Harold's reduced pension, watching your house fall apart, pretending you're not terrified about what happens when you can't take care of yourselves anymore. She turned back to Randall. I was trying to solve a problem before it became a disaster, she said. I was trying to protect our future, our financial security, our ability to help them without ruining ourselves. By lying to me, Randall repeated, by making me think my mother was developing dementia when she wasn't, by forging medical bills and inventing emergencies. By doing what needed to be done, Emery snapped, because none of you had the courage to do it yourselves. The room went quiet again as her words sank in. She hadn't just admitted to lying, she had justified it. She wasn't sorry. She was furious that we'd caught her and bitter that her plan had failed. Harold closed his notebook and met her gaze. "You're right about one thing," he said quietly. "Ada and I do have financial problems. Our income is limited. Our house needs repairs. We're certainly not rich." He paused, his eyes clear and unwavering. "But we are not helpless children to be managed and controlled. We are adults who've been making our own choices for decades. We have the right to face our difficulties with dignity, to decide our own future, and to ask for help if and when we choose to. Not when you decide for us." He rose slowly, his tall frame seeming to fill every corner of the room. "What we don't have," Harold said, "is any obligation to surrender our independence, our assets, or our autonomy to someone who thinks lying and manipulation are acceptable ways to solve problems." Emery's expression hardened. "Fine," she snapped. "Have it your way. Keep living in your little fantasy where everything magically works out. But don't expect us to keep paying for your delusions." She snatched her purse from the counter and strode toward the door. "When you end up in the hospital with no money and no plan, don't come crying to us for help," she threw over her shoulder. "You've made your choice." But before her hand could fully turn the doorknob, Harold spoke again. "Actually, Emery," he said, his voice steady and controlled, "there's something else you should know before you leave, something I haven't mentioned yet." She froze, her hand still on the knob. I could see the tension in her shoulders. "Ada and I may not be rich," Harold went on, "but we're not as powerless as you seem to think, and we certainly don't have to give up our independence to someone who'd rather lie to our own son than respect our decisions." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a second envelope, this one even thicker than the first. "You see," he said, "while you were busy inventing crises and manipulating Randall, I was making some phone calls of my own." I watched Emery's face shift, from anger to something much closer to fear. In that moment, I realized Harold's plan had gone far beyond anything I'd imagined. He opened the second envelope with the same calm precision he'd shown all afternoon. Every move was deliberate, almost surgical. Emery remained rooted by the door, her fingers still curled around the knob, but her full attention was locked on whatever he was about to reveal. 3 weeks ago," Harold said, pulling out a thick stack of official-looking documents, "I contacted a lawyer, not to talk about power of attorney or transferring property, like you suggested." He spread the first sheet on the table. I could see letterhead, formal, legal, but to talk about something else entirely. I wanted to understand exactly what qualifies as elder abuse under Texas law and what protections are available for people in our position. Emery's face went completely white. "Elder abuse?" she choked out. "Are you out of your mind? I was trying to help you." "Help us?" Harold asked calmly. "By lying about our medical conditions, by forging bills, by cutting us off from our friends and community, by convincing our son we were incompetent." His voice stayed level, but there was a sharpness to it I'd rarely heard in our 42 years together. He pulled out another page. "According to the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services," he said, "what you've done fits into multiple categories of elder abuse: psychological abuse through manipulation and threats, financial exploitation through fraudulent documents, and neglect through deliberate interference in our medical care and social life." Randall, who had seemed frozen in place, finally moved closer to the table. His face was a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. "Dad, what are you saying?" he asked quietly. Harold looked at him with profound sadness. "I'm saying your wife hasn't just been dishonest, Randall," he replied. "She has been committing crimes against your mother and me." The word crimes seemed to thicken the air. This wasn't just manipulation or toxic behavior. It was something far more serious. My legs suddenly felt weak, and I collapsed back into my chair. "The fake medical bills alone constitute fraud," Harold continued, pulling out even more paperwork. "But when you add the systematic attempt to convince you we were mentally incompetent, and the efforts to gain control of our property and finances through deception, you get a pattern of criminal elder abuse that could carry serious legal consequences." Emery finally let go of the doorknob and spun around. Her composure was completely gone. "You can't be serious," she said, almost shouting. "You're going to drag the police into this over family disagreements?" "Family disagreements?" I repeated, finding my voice again. To my surprise, it didn't shake. You made me believe I was losing my mind, Emery. You convinced my son I was slipping into dementia when I wasn't. You invented medical emergencies and financial disasters to pressure us into giving up our independence. Harold nodded and pulled out another set of documents. I also contacted the billing departments of every doctor and service provider listed on the fake bills you created, he said. Each one has confirmed that those charges were never made to our accounts, and they've provided sworn statements to prove it. He spread several official letters on the table. Dr. Morrison's office, the ER at Methodist Hospital, the physical therapy clinic on Elm Street, the medical equipment supplier on Fifth Avenue. All of them have documented that the bills you showed Randall are completely fabricated. Randall stared at the statements like they were written in another language, trying to process the fact that his reality had been manufactured. But why? He asked finally, his voice cracking. Why would you do all this, Emery? What did you want? For the first time, Emery seemed to shrink. The rage and defiance seemed to drain from her, leaving something smaller, worn down, desperate. I wanted us to have a future, she whispered. Do you have any idea what it costs to take care of aging parents? Do you know what happens to families who have to choose between their own financial stability and their parents' care? She stepped away from the door and moved closer to the table, her posture no longer predatory but pleading, almost broken. My own parents went through this with my grandparents, Emery said. They spent everything they had on nursing homes. They lost their house. They ended up in a tiny apartment with nothing left for themselves. Harold was still writing in his notebook, calmly recording every word of her confession. I wasn't going to let that happen to us, she went on. I wasn't going to stand by and watch you ruin yourself trying to support them when there were other options. Better options. Better for whom? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Better for everyone, she insisted, but even she didn't sound convinced anymore. If they moved into assisted living before everything fell apart, while they were still healthy enough to adjust, it would have been easier. They'd be happier, the money would stretch further, and we could protect our own future while still making sure they were taken care of. Randall set down the legal papers and looked at his wife as if seeing her clearly for the first time. So you decided to force it, he said quietly. You decided to make them feel like they had no choice. I decided to face reality before it was too late, Emery shot back. Someone had to be the adult here. Harold closed his notebook and fixed his gaze on her. The adult thing to do, he said evenly, would have been to talk honestly about your concerns and options. The adult thing would have been to respect our autonomy and our right to make our own decisions. He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. What you did was criminal, Emery, and the question now is what we're going to do about it. The silence that followed felt different from the others, a heavy, final kind of quiet, like the moment before a judge reads a verdict. What are you saying? Emery asked, though the fear in her eyes told me she already knew. Harold reached into the envelope and pulled out one last document. This, he said, placing it on the table, is a complaint form for the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services. It outlines everything you've done over the past 8 months, backed by all the evidence you see here. He set it beside the stack of medical records, bank statements, fake bills, legal opinions, and sworn statements. The physical proof of months of calculated abuse and manipulation. I haven't filed it yet, Harold said quietly. I wanted you to fully understand what you've done, and what it could mean, before I decide what to do. Emery stared at the form like it might bite her. You'd really destroy your son's marriage over this? She demanded. You destroyed my son's marriage, Harold replied. You did that when you lied to him, when you used him as a tool against his own parents. We're just deciding whether you should face the legal consequences for your choices. Randall, who had been silent, stepped closer. His face was pale, but his jaw was set. What happens if you file it? He asked. Harold looked at him with deep sadness. There'll be an investigation, he said. Emery could be charged with elder abuse, fraud, and financial exploitation. If she's convicted, there could be heavy fines. And possibly jail time. The room went quiet again as we all absorbed that reality. I found myself thinking back to the day Randall first brought Emery into our home, how hopeful I'd been, how grateful I was that he'd found someone who seemed to love him. And now, here we were, standing in the ruins of that trust. There's something else, Harold added, reaching back into the envelope, something I found while gathering all this. He pulled out another bank statement, but this one wasn't ours. This is from an account Emery opened 6 months ago, he said, apparently in preparation for managing our finances once she got power of attorney. Randall leaned over the table to read it, and I watched his face change. "There's money in here," he said slowly. "A lot of it." Harold nodded. "Nearly $15,000 deposited over the last 6 months, he said. Money that was supposedly going toward our rising expenses and medical bills. The realization hit me like a punch. Not only had Emery lied about our health and our costs, she'd taken Randall's money on the strength of those lies and hidden it in an account we never knew existed. "You were stealing from us," Randall said, his voice hollow. "You were taking money from me based on fake bills and keeping it for yourself." "It wasn't stealing," Emery protested, her voice fraying. "It was planning. I was saving for their future care, for when they really need it." "In an account only you controlled," Harold pointed out, "without our knowledge or consent. With money you got through fraud," I added, my voice stronger now that the full extent of her betrayal was laid bare. Randall dropped into one of the kitchen chairs, burying his face in his hands. "How could I have been so blind?" he murmured. "How did I believe all of this without ever questioning it?" "Because you trusted your wife," Harold said gently. "Because you believed that someone who said she loved you wouldn't build her plans on lies. Because you're a good man who wants to protect his family. And she used that goodness for her own goals." Emery was crying now, but her tears weren't those of someone who regretted what she'd done. They were the tears of someone furious at being caught, devastated that her careful scheme was falling apart. "You don't understand," she sobbed. "I was trying to protect our future. I was trying to make sure we'd be okay when all of this finally did become a crisis. By inventing a crisis that wasn't there," I said quietly. "By stripping us of our dignity, our independence, and our relationship with our son." Harold picked up the complaint form and held it in both hands, weighing it as if it were our entire future. "Emery," he said at last, "you have 30 seconds to convince me why I shouldn't file this today." His words seemed to freeze the air. This was it, a final, narrow chance for her to show even a scrap of real remorse. Emery's eyes flicked desperately around the room, from Harold to me to Randall, searching for a crack, a weakness, some lingering sympathy she could twist to her advantage. But for the first time in months, she found none. She started, then stopped. "I can't," she whispered at last. In that moment, I knew Harold's plan had reached its end. 5 months later, I stood in our backyard garden, watching Harold carefully tuck tomato seedlings into the raised beds he'd built just a few weeks earlier. The late afternoon sun was warm on my face, and somewhere nearby, I could hear children laughing and playing in the same neighborhood where we'd raised our boy, built our life, and where we had decided we would continue to live with dignity and independence for as long as we chose. The change hadn't happened overnight. After Emery's confession and Harold laying out the full extent of her manipulation and abuse, the road forward had been both obvious and incredibly hard. Harold did file the complaint with Adult Protective Services, just like he'd said. The investigation that followed confirmed everything we feared, and even more. Emery was charged with multiple counts of elder abuse, fraud, and financial exploitation. She eventually pled guilty to reduced charges and received 3 years probation, community service, and a court order to repay the money she had taken, plus damages. But the legal outcome, as important as it was, turned out to be the easy part. The hardest part was rebuilding our relationship with Randall, helping him work through the betrayal, the guilt, the shame, learning how to trust each other again after everything that had happened. For the first month after that day, Randall could barely speak to us. He was eaten up with guilt over how he'd treated us, furious with himself for swallowing Emery's lies whole, and wrestling with how someone he loved so deeply could have manipulated him so thoroughly. I remember the afternoon he finally came over, about 6 weeks after Emery had moved out of their home. He sat in our living room on the same old couch he'd sprawled across as a teenager, his head in his hands, and sobbed like the little boy who used to run to us when thunderstorms scared him. "I don't even know how to apologize for this," he said, voice muffled. "I don't know how to make up for the way I treated you." Harold sat beside him, just as he had when Randall was small, and put an arm around his shoulders. "You don't need to apologize for being manipulated," Harold told him gently. "You need to learn from it and you need to help us rebuild what was damaged. But you don't have to carry the guilt for someone else's crimes. It took time, patience, and more than a few sessions with a family counselor. But slowly, we found our way back to each other. Randall learned to recognize the signs of manipulation he'd missed before. We learned to trust his heart again, even when we didn't agree with every choice he made. And together, we built a new kind of relationship, one grounded in honesty, respect, and mutual support instead of obligation, fear, and guilt. The financial emergency Emery had invented turned out to be difficult but manageable once we finally talked honestly and looked at real numbers instead of fabricated ones. Yes, we live on a fixed income. Yes, the house needs repairs. Yes, we'll eventually face health issues that might force hard decisions. But we're facing those realities together as a family, with the truth out in the open and with respect for each other's autonomy. Randall helped us draw up a practical budget and a plan for potential future care needs. We made a few changes around the house: grab bars, railings, better lighting, to make it safer and more accessible. We set clear boundaries and agreements about when and how we would ask for help, if and when that day comes. Most importantly, we took our voices back. No one was making decisions for us based on fake emergencies and exaggerated fears. No one was cutting us off from our friends or community. No one was trying to convince us we were incompetent, broken, or a burden. I reconnected with my old friends, including Mrs. Kowalski next door, who had quietly wondered why we'd drifted away over the last year. I started volunteering at church again, something my heart had missed more than I realized. Harold signed up for a woodworking class at the community center and started making friends with other retirees who shared his love for building things with his hands. We were living again, not just existing under someone else's version of what's best for us, but actually living with choice, with connection, with dignity. "Ada," Harold called from the garden, pulling me out of my thoughts. "Can you bring me the watering can from the garage?" I smiled as I went to get it, struck by how something so small, a simple, ordinary request, could feel like such a blessing after months of having every part of our lives filtered through Emery's manufactured crises and control. When I handed him the watering can, he straightened and looked at me with the same steady gaze that had carried me through 42 years of marriage and the storm of the past year. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. I thought about it seriously. The last year had been one of the most painful seasons of our lives. We'd been betrayed by someone we trusted, pushed into doubting ourselves and each other, and forced to face the terrifying possibility that our own son might choose his wife's lies over our truth. But we had also discovered a strength inside us we hadn't fully seen before. Harold's quiet resolve to record the truth and protect our family had been nothing short of extraordinary. My own ability to finally speak up and defend our rights had surprised even me. And Randall's willingness to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt, and then work to repair our relationship, showed us the kind of man we had really raised. "No regrets about standing up for ourselves," I said at last. "No regrets about refusing to be victims. No regrets about fighting for our right to live with dignity." Harold nodded and turned back to his tomato plants, but I could see the quiet satisfaction in his face. Just then, we heard a car pull into the driveway. I glanced toward the front of the house and saw Randall getting out of his truck, a toolbox in his hand. "What's he doing here?" I asked, though I was already smiling. "I might have mentioned that the kitchen faucet has been dripping," Harold said, a little too casually. Randall walked over with a slightly hesitant air he still sometimes carried, as if afraid of overstepping. The divorce had been finalized 3 months earlier, and he was slowly learning how to live without Emery's constant control hanging over him. "Hey, Mom, Dad," he said, setting down the toolbox. "Thought I'd take a look at that faucet if that's all right." "Of course it's all right," I said, reaching up to hug him. "But you don't have to fix everything around here. We can afford a plumber now, you know." Randall smiled, and this time the smile actually reached his eyes. "I know," he said, "but I want to help. Is that okay?" The difference was small but important. He wasn't helping because he'd been told we were helpless. He wasn't acting out of fear, obligation, or some manufactured crisis. He was helping because he loved us, and because that's what family does. "It's more than okay," Harold said, clapping him on the shoulder. "It's appreciated." As Randall headed inside to work on the faucet, Harold and I went back to the garden. The sun was starting to set, stretching long shadows across the yard where Randall had once played, where we'd hosted birthday parties and barbecues, where we'd built a life no amount of manipulation could truly erase. "You know," I said, pulling a few stubborn weeds near the peppers, "I used to be scared that we were becoming a burden, that we were holding Randall back from his own life and happiness." Harold paused with the watering can and looked over at me. "And now?" he asked. "Now I realize that was never really the question," I replied. "The real question was whether we'd be allowed to grow older with dignity and make our own choices, or whether someone else would make those choices for us to fit their own agenda." I stood up, brushed the dirt off my hands, and looked around at our modest but well-kept home, our thriving garden, our neighborhood full of familiar faces and memories. "We may not be rich," I said, "and we certainly won't live forever. But we're not a burden. We're a family, and families support each other through hard times, without lies, without manipulation, and without force." Harold set the watering can aside and took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine just like they had on our wedding day 42 years earlier. "Emery was wrong about a lot of things," he said quietly. "But she was especially wrong about this. She thought love meant control, telling people what's best for them, making decisions for others in the name of protection." He glanced toward the house, where we could hear Randall working on the faucet, whistling softly to himself. "Real love," Harold continued, "means respecting people enough to let them live their own lives, to let them make their own mistakes, to let them ask for help when they're ready, not when someone else decides it's time. It means being there to support them, not to control them." As if on cue, Randall appeared at the back door. "Boss, it's fixed," he called out with a grin, and I noticed the front steps could use some reinforcement. "Want me to take a look at that next weekend?" "If you have time and want to," I called back. "Only if it fits your schedule." He gave us a thumbs up and disappeared into the house. Harold squeezed my hand gently. "You think he's learned the difference between helping and controlling?" I watched our son through the kitchen window as he put his tools away, moving with the ease of a man rebuilding his life on truth instead of lies. "I think we all have," I said. As the sun dipped behind the house, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks, I felt a deep peace I hadn't felt in a very long time. We had faced a serious threat to our independence, our dignity, and our family bonds. We had been lied to, manipulated, and abused by someone we trusted and welcomed into our lives. But we survived. More than that, we took our lives back. We reclaimed our voices, our choices, and our right to live according to our own values. The future will still bring challenges. We're in our 60s and 70s now. Time doesn't stop just because we wish it would. But whatever comes next, we'll face it together, with honesty and mutual respect, as partners in life, not as problems for someone else to manage. As I watched Harold put away the gardening tools and Randall lock up his toolbox, I thought, this is how it should be. This is how it was always meant to be. Some people might hear our story and see it as a warning about elder abuse and manipulation. Others might see it as a reminder that family relationships require boundaries and vigilance. For me, it's something simpler. It's proof that you're never too old to stand up for yourself, never too vulnerable to reclaim your dignity, never too late to rebuild relationships on truth instead of lies. Harold had been right to document everything, right to gather evidence, right to confront what was happening instead of pretending it away. But most importantly, he was right to believe that our family was worth fighting for, that our relationship with our son could survive what had been done to it, and that love founded on respect and honesty is stronger than control built on fear. As we walked back toward the house, still hand in hand, I felt grateful for many things. For a husband who protected our family with patience and wisdom, for a son who found the courage to face the truth and help rebuild what was broken, for friends and neighbors who welcomed us back without judgment or interrogation. But most of all, I felt grateful for the simple, powerful gift of living my own life, of making my own choices and facing my own future with my dignity intact. That's what Emery tried to take from us. That's what we refused to let go. And in the end, that made all the difference. Now I'm curious about you, listening to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever gone through something similar or seen someone else experience it? Tell me in the comments. I read as many as I can. And before you go, on the final screen, I'm leaving 2 more of this channel's most powerful stories. They're full of twists and emotions, and I think they'll really surprise you. Thank you for staying with me to the end.